we carry on talking as though we still had the power, but in fact we don't. So we then talk about our values. We must. One of the phrases which you hear in Parliament a great deal is we must. We must, as though we had the power. We must ensure that the Chinese stop persecuting the Uruguayans. We must. I don't know. All you can really say is this is a historical reflex of some kind. Maybe it's the way people are brought up and are educated at universities, or in some way, just to say these things.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I've got the great honor of talking to Lord Robert Skidelsky, who is an Emeritus Professor of Political Economy at Warwick University, the author of a 3-volume biography of the economist John Maynard Keynes, and since 1991 he has been serving as a member of the House of Lords, that is, the upper chamber of the British Parliament, of course. Lord Skidelsky, welcome.
Thank you.
Lord Kidelsky, you recently wrote a opinion piece in The Guardian in which you criticized UK politics toward the war in Ukraine. And then on Monday, March 17, you again repeated your criticism also in Parliament. You spoke about the need for peace and diplomacy, and you've been criticized for that again. Could you maybe give us the core of what you think the UK is currently doing wrong in its approach toward, well, Ukraine and Russia?
Well, thank you. I've been roughly saying the same thing for the last 2.5 years, which is that we must have a peace policy and not a war policy. And we can't have a war policy because if we were really serious about a war, we would just risk dangerous escalation. Because Russia is obviously much stronger than Ukraine, and so a war policy, it doesn't make any sense. And yet the British, my criticism of the British policy is that every single statement of our governments in the last 3 years has said we will support Ukraine until it achieves victory. And that was always mendacious. It was always a lie. They were never going to do that. But what it did was encourage the war to go on and on. Now, what's happened is that the Americans have simply thrown that into the dustbin. That script is now scrapped. So what they're trying to do, I think the British, together with the Europeans, is to find some way of inserting themselves into a peace process, which they never initiated. So I think that's the difficulty for British policy at the moment.
I completely agree with your observation, and I'm actually worried that the way that the UK and the Europeans are trying to go about the peace in Ukraine is essentially is counterproductive to actually the peace process that's happening at the moment, because it seems that the UK and Europe still clings on to a peace which is basically a surrender of Russia. Do you see it also that way?
Well, you see, there's these words we use. For example, the British have now said what we favour is a just and durable peace. That's the formula. Those are the words. Well, what is just? I mean, durable, yes, of course. But if you add justice to it, then of course you're immediately almost destroying the possibility of a peace, because we understand justice in this country mainly as a restoration of the territorial integrity of Ukraine and the payment by Russia of reparations for the damage, the bringing war criminals to trial, and so on. We understand those as the requirements of a just peace. But if that's our policy, we're not going to get peace at all, because that you only get that sort of peace, I think, if you defeat a country in war. Then you can extract that kind of peace, but we're nowhere near either doing that or suggesting that that's the way the war should go. So the policy is very counterproductive. And here's another example of a counterproductive policy: the idea that Britain and France and one or two other countries, which we call the coalition of the willing, will send peacekeeping or peace enforcing uh, troops and aircraft to Ukraine. Well, that was always a no starter. Uh, it was mad to think anyone would agree with it. Certainly, the Americans didn't agree with it because it seemed to require what's called an American backstop. And the Russians wouldn't agree to it because they'd been fighting a war to stop NATO troops coming into Ukraine. And to suggest that you have a bunch of NATO troops and you don't call them NATO, you call them coalition of the willing there to enforce a ceasefire is something they would never have accepted.
Where comes this, let's not call it an obsession, but where comes this worldview from that this is feasible, that these are not just ideas, but that this is a policy that Mr. Keir Starmer is actually going after? Because when he was in the US 3 or 4 weeks ago, he stood next to Donald Trump, sat next to Donald Trump, and Donald Trump actually asked him, "So can you take the Russians on by yourself?" And Mr. Keir Starmer only could like smile, right? Because it was obviously the answer is no. Why
Yeah.
why is this idea there that the Europeans somehow need to lead a a force, with knowing that the only way that this can be achieved is with the Americans in the back? Where's this coming from?
Well, they want to maintain their relevance. I mean, their script's been unended. I mean, their position's been upended, I should say. And so, in a way, now what happens is a matter of America and Russia, or Trump and Putin, and Ukraine. And Ukraine is in the it has to will more or less have to accept what the two great powers can agree on in this. Now, where does Europe fit in? Um, it doesn't, because its policy was not to talk to Putin at all. There's been no diplomatic contact between European leaders and the Russian leadership for 2.5 or 3 years. So they're, they're not part of this bargain. They haven't got a place in it. And that's why they're terrified of sort of they're really terrified of a that Putin and Trump will form a new alliance which will exclude the Europeans somehow, and that America will withdraw from NATO, will abandon NATO, and that will force the Europeans to think seriously about their defense. And that's where I think the game is now. Europe, all the Europeans have said we've got to increase our defense spending. They argue that that's to meet the Russian threat, but it's not so much to meet the Russian threat, because I don't think there is a Russian threat actually, but it's to follow the demand of the United States that Europe start paying a lot more for its own defense. At the moment, I think it's right to say that America contributes 75% of the cost of NATO. And Trump is saying, we're not going to defend you forever. If you want a separate policy, you've got to have a separate defense policy. And otherwise, we decide the main issues between Russia and Europe.
Something that strikes me as, incredible is that we had 30 years since the end of the Cold War, so after 1991, 30 years to basically, cash in the peace dividend, to get something out of the fact that the Soviet Union was no more, and that even Russia wanted to integrate into the Western structures. And if you look at the way that the war against terror since 2001, how Russia actually supported a lot of what happened, at least in 2001, and how people like Gorbachev and after him also Yeltsin tried to continue building that common European house, and how that was completely, utterly made impossible also by the way that the Europeans approached Russia. I wonder what can be done in order to in order to de-escalate this situation? Because the escalation is not just taking place since 2021. The escalation is going on since 25 years with Russia.
Well, both America and Europe were really responsible for the failure to cash in on the peace dividend, and I blame America more than Europe. And the thing really is that the idea was we won, and therefore we can do what we create the new world order, um, and um, and the new world order, because we won, is unipolar. America's the only pole left. In a way, the language was quite logical if you accept that premise. There was a bipolar world. One of the poles was now knocked over. Therefore, there was a unipolar world. And the unipolar world was the American-centered world. And Russia should have no consideration, any more consideration than any defeated enemy, defeated but not conquered. And I think that was it. That's why the peace dividend failed to materialize in the end, because it was based on a hegemonic premise. And gradually, as Russia recovered strength, and China, of course, was coming up very, very fast economically in this period, the idea naturally developed of a multipolar world. And that became the official doctrine of all the people who weren't part of the NATO-American alliance. And that's how I think it developed. Very interestingly, Keynes, I've written a lot about the economist John Maynard Keynes, when he wrote The Economic Consequences of the Peace in 1919, which would attack the Treaty of Versailles. He never blamed the Germans. He said, we've got to live with the Germans. And we've got to find a way of living with people we might not like or approve of, because otherwise, he said, and this is the phrase, vengeance will come. And this is what happened really, in a way, after the end of the Cold War and the recovery by Russia of not only some strength, but some self-confidence, which had been completely shattered. Then this great feeling of humiliation. And we should have absolutely nailed down our original promise that NATO would not be expanded eastward. And we should have nailed it down. I mean, we never did. We were careless about it because we'd won. What obstacle was there to the endless eastward expansion of NATO? And after all, it wasn't just that we had won, but we were good. We were the good side. Therefore, we had no aggressive intentions. NATO was simply an umbrella for all peace-loving nations who feared that Russia would sort of attack them. So that was the mindset.
What I also encounter with colleagues and friends from Southeast Asia and with colleagues from the global South, to them, the threat that NATO poses to Russia is quite evident, and most of them say, like, yeah, look, 1999, Serbia, Yugoslavia is not part of NATO, right? It was not NATO territory, but NATO went to bomb there, and NATO went to bomb other places, including Libya. And it is, I mean, obviously, this thing will be perceived as a potential threat by the Russians. The only ones who don't see that are NATO members who keep saying we are the most peace-loving military alliance in the history of military alliances. Is this intentional, like willing blindness to how others will perceive you, or is there really a mental blockade in the way that a lot of people in Europe perceive themselves, NATO?
I think it's a mental block. I think we cannot begin to imagine how we look to other people, because we're right. And Europe, in the way Europe and America think of themselves, they are in the direct tradition of the Enlightenment, of progress, of pacifism. And standing in the way are all these bad states. Now, these bad states are lagging behind, unfortunately, but one day they'll catch up. And anything we can do to encourage them to catch up is justified, because once they have caught up and once they have accepted our values, then the world will be peaceful. So you can almost justify this blindness in terms of a peace policy, a long-term peace policy, to make everyone think out, everyone in the Deep South, everyone in Asia, think like us, adopt our values, and then we'll have perpetual peace. But meanwhile, you have to have lots of wars in order to get to that state of affairs. And that's where the blindness comes in, that we can't see anything from another point of view. And the point you make is perfectly right. In East Asia and over much of the global South, NATO is seen as aggressive. And the point is, NATO is a successor of all those imperial powers who dominated the rest of the world in the 19th and early 20th century. So of course they see a connection. We would have had to have very, very good diplomacy to have really navigated that, but we didn't. We were careless because we won.
You put it beautifully, and I think that is exactly the problem that Europe at the moment has. It's just that it surprises me because there is a lot of good thinkers. There's obviously a lot of people who also academics who try to look at things from different perspectives. But these days it is hard to convince anyone in Europe to actually rethink the general framing of the Ukraine war. And that's also the general framing, as you said, of this Enlightenment tradition, which obviously had so many negative ways of showing itself, right? And especially if you look at the way that the colonized part of the world experienced the Europeans, they experienced them as highly violent, right? Why is this part of our European history still so alien to many Europeans?
Well, you know something, I think most of the experts who pronounce on Ukraine and on international relations now are all part of the defense establishment. Um, you know, they're said to be independent, but they're not really. And I mean, there are a whole lot of people around whose living and influence really depends on them being connected to the defense and foreign policy establishment of the American and European countries. They're not independent, and newspapers follow that. Now, the newspaper view is very, 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 very troubling, and I don't understand quite how it works even. But every single mainstream journal fell behind the official government view and has remained so all through the war. It was you mentioned, I think, that an article I wrote in The Guardian. It was the first time I'd managed to get an article in any mainstream journal for nearly 3 years. Why was that? It's still something I think historians are going to argue about forever. There are a few independent experts and really independent thinkers, but you can almost count them on one hand. I mean, for example, one very well-known one is Jeffrey Sachs. And I mean, he speaks out very, very lucidly and courageously. He thinks America is basically to blame for all this trouble. And that doesn't make him very popular. But of course, he has a very, very large following. But he's genuinely independent thinker. And I can think of one or two others. But most of them are connected with defense, the defense and foreign policy establishment. That is probably the answer. But why newspapers should have, in our country, I'm thinking of the UK, I'm not so, I don't know enough about what goes on elsewhere. I think there's more variety in some of the other European countries and even in America. But why Britain should have been so simply single scripted. And I call it warmongering.
I call it that too, and I think this is what it is. And we need an explanatory model at some point to understand why it is that in liberal societies in which the press is nominally free, it still then is on something leads to a lockstep, right? Of the
Yeah.
of these opinion making instruments.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I attributed three things in Britain. First of all, this sort of moral approach that, morality is with us, and morality is basically democracy. And therefore, this is our mission. Um, a second thing is, I think this is an imperial reflex. And Britain was uniquely used to laying down the law for large parts of the world. And of course, the English language was the medium through which was done. And the third thing is the terror of appeasement. Appeasement. The appeasing of Hitler is never far from the minds of people who talk about these things in Britain, and the shame of appeasing Hitler and therefore unleashing Hitler on the world by giving up a bit of Czechoslovakia to him in 1938. That's always there. It's just below the surface. If you let Putin get away with anything here,
But
he will be like Hitler. He will go on to Georgia. He'll go on to the Baltic states. He'll go on to Moldova. And after that, when he gets, seizes all those, he'll think about Poland. And how can people think in this way, in such a decontextualized way? I can't understand. But nevertheless, it's there. I promise you.
yeah, yeah, me too. I completely believe you, and this is what we read all the time in all of these newspapers. But what baffles me is that this narrative, of course, um, relies on utterly, completely ignoring all the counter evidence there is. And I keep saying, look, the biggest counter evidence that you need is Mongolia. If your narrative is the autocratic regimes want to destroy democracies because they fear them so much, then explain to me how it is that little sandwiched Mongolia is democratizing beautifully, constantly, and neither the Russians nor the Chinese are intervening at all. They're both super happy with it, right? That's one. The other one is, of course, that this narrative also excludes the logical consequence. Because if Mr. Putin was Adolf Hitler, he would be an Adolf Hitler with nuclear war bombs, and you would need to fight a war to the end with nuclear Hitler, and that
Yeah,
is
yeah.
also excluded. How do you think this is possible that both of these strains?
Well, it is amazing, and you could have added to Mongolia, Finland, which coexisted with Russia for 80 years without the Russians after war, by the way, and until I'm not saying that Putin has been brilliant in everything he's done. I mean, to my way of thinking, it was a mistake to invade Ukraine, based on, I mean, he was provoked, yes, but he miscalculated seriously, yes. I thought, I think he thought he would achieve his aims in a very, very short period of time. But in fact, what he did was he got two extra people into NATO,
Yes.
but through and so he made some miscalculations which are quite serious. So I'm not saying, look, I'm Putin's done everything brilliantly and America's done everything terribly. I'm not saying that. But what I am agreeing with you completely on is that there's no evidence that Putin is just an expansionist. The evidence is enormous that his main idea was to prevent NATO putting missiles on Russian frontiers. That was the main object.
And it What is the belief among your colleagues in the House of Lords? And you are, so far as I understand, a pretty lonely voice that says we should use diplomacy again. Um,
Yeah.
uh, why is the British political establishment also so hell-bent on this approach?
Yeah, well, I'm very much a lone voice in the House of Lords. I think there are three of us who sort of regularly, more or less, sing to the same tune out of several hundred. Um, and there are others who say, look, I'm sure we agree with a lot of what you say, but we can't say it just now. So there's a certain lack of courage uh, there. Um, yeah, I mean, I think things change. There will be some changes going on, and it's Trump that's really done it. I mean, there was a whole stagnant set of international relations which was drifting inevitably into continuous fighting, with the possibility of escalation, with Ukrainians slowly losing ground, with enormous loss of life. And that was sort of, there was no way of breaking into that. And Trump did break into it. And what the British line, as I think I mentioned earlier, is we want a just, but in order to be durable, the peace has got to be just. Because it's so difficult to define what justice is, that means you're in effect committed to going on fighting, unless you conquer Russia in some way. But that, of course, no one is really prepared to do, to risk that kind of war against Russia. So the whole British, and to my mind, European position is disingenuous. It's sort of misleading. It's self-deluding. It's cliche-ridden. Um, it's as though people have had bits of their brains lobotomized so that they can't think about these things any longer. I find it terrifying.
I agree with you because it's terrifying because if it continues, then it will lead down even to more war because again, a just peace means imposing the peace, which means fighting the war. And
Yeah.
but at the same time, you also hinted at the fact that people and Britain is not willing to fight a larger war, and we've seen that, right? Had NATO been willing to integrate Ukraine and fight the war, they could have done so from day one, right?
Yeah.
They could
Yeah.
have said, "Fine, we send all of the troops, we'll have a big war with Russia," but they said
Yeah.
no to that.
They said
So
no to it.
because how does the British political establishment and so on deal with um this discrepancy that the
Uh,
words are all belligerent, but actually in the end you try not to have that war, which I think is a good thing. I don't want them to stop
yeah.
doing that,
Yeah.
but
I mean, I think it's morally disgusting to fight a war to the last drop of Ukrainian blood.
yeah, yeah.
I think it's morally disgusting. If you really believe that, Ukraine is fighting on the front line of democracy, you've got to go in there and
Most
fight with them. I mean, obviously, otherwise it's immoral.
but most of your colleagues would argue that that's not what they want. They don't want to sacrifice the last Ukrainian, but in effect that's what they're doing. How do they live with that? That they say like we need to the Ukrainians have to keep on fighting, but we want peace for them. This doesn't it does it make sense to them?
Well, I don't know, there are words to describe this. One of them is cognitive dissonance.
Mm.
Cognitive dissonance, I think, people they inhabit one particular mindset and they can't think outside it until something shatters the mindset and forces them to. And I think that's what Trump's doing. I mean, people hate Trump because he smashes everything up all over the place. But what he's doing is smashing up mindsets, and that's very dangerous because we live by our mindsets, we live by our rules, we live by, let's say, the rule governed international order. We're used to those rules. And that rules are very, very important to have because they're a barrier against uncertainty, danger, all kinds of things. They give you a way of predicting how other people will act. And so in that sense, I'm not against rules. But when the rules simply become part of a mindless drift to war, then of course someone who breaks up the rules is to be very valued. And I said in my speech in the House of Lords, and I stick by that, I said if Trump does manage to achieve peace in Ukraine, he will deserve a Nobel Peace Prize.
Because it's of
And
course very difficult to do that. It's very hard to get these guns to be silent. And he actually said so recently. There's a lot of guns pointing at each other. It's not
yeah,
just the states. It's these troops, right? And you need to
yeah.
somehow get them to a process to stop firing.
I think the key, obviously, is Russia and America. I mean, they're the two leading actors now. If they can actually get together a peace deal that involves genuine concessions on the part of both Russia and Ukraine, then something will be possible within a framework. And this is where I think Trump can offer something to Russia. He can say, look, you're now our main partner in the world, in this part of the world, and we will treat you as such always. He can maybe offer something to rehabilitate Russia's self-respect as a great power. He may be able to offer that. I don't know. But Putin obviously is also very concerned that there'll be a temporary ceasefire and that they'll go on supplying Ukraine, and then Russia will lose its military advantage, which it now has.
Yeah, and of course, I do think the self-respect of the Russians actually was never bigger than now because they managed to prevail for so long in something, and it's horrible. It's horrible what is going on, but something that the Europeans also and with the Americans could help Russia with is, of course, finding a new agreement with Ukraine and also
Yeah.
the Russians. No Russian I know, no, or nobody that I've ever heard of said we should have the whole of Ukraine because they know swallowing that eastern part of Ukraine would be a poisoned pill, right? So what
Yeah.
you need is a way to get to a working arrangement with the previous enemies, and that's something where Europe and the US can help a lot, right? In order to heal these wounds.
Yeah.
Um, just
I think I entirely agree with you. And when I talk occasionally to um, ministers of the government, some of them still talk to me from time to time. I say, look, try and work on the Ukrainians. I mean, to get them to understand that a number of things. First of all, that they haven't lost the war and they're not going to lose the war. I mean, they've actually stopped the Russians from doing what Putin originally wanted, which was going to be very quick, install a subordinate regime in Kiev, and then get out. I mean, that hasn't happened. And in other words, Ukraine has fought for its independence. And I think that's an incredible accomplishment. And it's something we never give credit for here because we always say any compromised peace involves handing Ukraine to Russia, but it doesn't. That's the point. It doesn't. And I don't think Donbass is the chief issue here at all. I think on that, I think Russia can be brought to a compromise. This is a point Anatol Levin has made as well. In return for a proper security guarantee. One of the things our leaders now say is, well, we've got to ensure that there's a proper security guarantee for Ukraine. Any peace deal must include that. But what about a proper security guarantee to Russia? It's as though Russia had no security concerns and that its act was entirely unprovoked. That is still the script.
And again, somebody has to explain to me why it is that Ukraine needs security guarantees, but Mongolia doesn't. Why is Mongolia surviving as an independent state without NATO security guarantees?
Yeah,
This is an
because
obsession.
because Mongolia hasn't been promised NATO membership. That's what they're saying. You see, but of course, what they want to say is that on the one hand, they want to say yes. NATO is a bit of a problem for Russia. But on the other hand, it's perfectly reasonable for Ukraine to join NATO because NATO is a peaceful organization and doesn't threaten anyone. they've got these two incompatible things in their heads. They say, yes, Russia has a mindset which is obsolete and inaccurate based on the fear of NATO. Go back to Prince Igor, and Russia's always feared these encircling claws of the West. But this is all out of date, completely out of date. There's no threat. Russia faces no threat at all from anyone.
Can you can you think of, as a historian, of another time or place when you think in a society, as like in the European society, you have very important narratives that are at the same time like so contradicting, like your own narrative. Again, the narrative of, oh, NATO is peace loving, or Russia is such a danger, but Russia is also so weak. I mean, we have so many of these contradicting narratives. Can you think of another time or place where this was the case, and what happened there?
Well, I think there's been less of that conflict in the past than there is now, and the reason is, I think, that the people who um, uh, uh, um, gave the dominant narrative, the people who wrote the dominant narrative, were also the people who had the power, and therefore they could impose their narrative. They weren't faced with the contradiction. Whereas now we still want to write the narrative, but without the power. And so that gives rise to a kind of a moral self-righteousness, but which actually stops people thinking seriously about things. In fact, what we have is the idea, instead of power, we have values. And instead of hard power, we have soft power. And all these things are meant to be a substitute. So we carry on talking as though we still had the power, but in fact we don't. So we then talk about our values. We must. One of the phrases which you hear in Parliament a great deal is we must. We must. As though we had the power. We must ensure that the Chinese stop persecuting the Uyghurs. We must. We must. We must. I don't know. All you can really say is this is a historical reflex of some kind. Maybe it's the way people are brought up and educated at universities, or in some way, just to say these things. The law giving. I struggle with it. I find it hard to get over this.
I find this terrifying, because it leads to a lot of very bad things. On the other hand, it's fascinating to see that it is so difficult for the Europeans, not just the UK, for the Europeans, to kind of grow out of this mindset of imposing everything, while still claiming that they're not the ones who are imperial, they are not the ones who impose. How long do you think it will take for the realization to set in? Because I think there's people who actually have realized this, but this is a tiny part yet of the European population.
Yeah,
the general public hasn't.
No, I think the general public hasn't. You're right. I think one of the things is, in Europe, there's a great big hole, and that hole is Germany. They've tried to build a European Union without German force. Economics, certainly, but the core of a European sort of autonomy would have been Germany. And you see, we have our guilt, the British, of having appeased Hitler. The Germans have much more guilt at having produced Hitler. And therefore, they can't take any real initiative in being, they feel they can't take any real initiative, because any attempt the Germans make to lead Europe will remind others of the old German attempt to dominate Europe. So the Germans, at the back, and France is more or less pushed into a leading position in Europe. Britain is out of Europe. So the Europeans have a huge problem in developing a common defense and foreign policy.
Are we Europeans, and again, as so often, deadlocked in a straitjacket of our own making? That's, that we just create all of these opposing forces that then create disaster instead of resolutions over the long period.
We, you see, we were all right, we thought, in Biden's time, because America was, in fact, the surrogate state for Europe. And because it defended Europe, essentially it defended Europe. And Europe, I mean, in a way, Europe was a protectorate of the United States. And the Americans have got tired of doing that, I think. And one reason, it's not just that their policy view has shifted, but also it's very expensive to have protectorates. You can't tax them properly. You protect them and you gain the kudos of sort of really talking to them from a position, that sort of position, but you can't tax them. And therefore, the Americans felt increasingly that they weren't getting their value for money. And why were they sort of still in this position of protecting Europe? Well, that was the Cold War. It started in the Cold War, and it started with that particular narrative that the Russians, with their huge Second World War armies, which had defeated Hitler, were ready to sweep over the rest of Europe. That led to the formation of NATO. That led to the American nuclear guarantee to Europe. Now, the Americans can't quite accept that the same narrative should continue, though in the guise of another Russian threat. And so the Americans, don't like being, sold a pup, taken down the river. They think they're being taken for a ride. And that, I think, is at the base of Trump's new policy, which I think a lot of Americans support, actually.
I think so too. We should continue this discussion and another time, because there's still a lot of things I'd like to ask you, because you have a very beautiful grasp on these issues. But I know you have a lunch appointment, so I would like to thank you very much.
Well, thank
Lord
you.
Skidelsky, people who want to read from you, is there a place where you regularly publish things?
No more. I used to publish for Project Syndicate. Once a month I had a column, but then they tried to censor what I wrote on Ukraine particularly. So I said, I'm not going to write for you anymore. I had the same, Jeff Sachs had the same experience. There is censorship.
There is.
And we both independently decided. So I haven't got a regular platform now, and I'm thinking of how I might get one.
Substack. Substack is a wonderful self-publishing platform.
You're right. Substack is the way, and I'm trying to do that.
Let me know when you do. I'll make sure to publish it among also this audience. Lord Skidelsky, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you for asking me.